are firmly in the middle of election season, but if the Modi government were to have its way, there should only be one such season every 5 years. One nation, one election. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. In a few moments from now, we'll be joined by Yogendra Yadav, who is, of course, a prominent voice of the opposition, who has taken on the government for its approval to the one nation, one election policy. This policy has been put forth in a detailed report submitted by former President Ramnath Kovind, the panel led by him, and it has also got the approval of the Union Cabinet. However, it still needs to go through Parliament. And there's still a big question mark over whether the BJP's own allies, remember the BJP itself is below the majority mark, will give their stamp of approval on this proposal. But it has started a fierce debate. Many of those who support this policy argue that till before 1970, till the late 1960s, a one nation, one election is what India practiced and believed in. That frequent elections are a waste of the exchequer and keep our politicians distracted. Those who oppose it have called it, as Yogendra Yadav has, a sequel to demonetisation, a Tughlaki Farman. Let me bring up our newsmaker today. Yogendra Yadav is with us. He has a very interesting and provocative column out on this. Yogendra ji, always a pleasure. You have described this proposal, or this cabinet proposal, I should call it, or a cabinet decision that still needs parliamentary approval. In a way, you've likened it to demonetization. And you have compared the report to how the RBI behaved during or before demonetization, describing it to be a made-to-order report. But many people would start with the basic question कि पहले भी तो होता था, पहले भी तो होता था. It's not as if this country has never known one nation, one election. It is Indira Gandhi who changed that when she advanced the date of elections. So अगर पहले होता था तो अब क्यों नहीं?
First thing first, Barkha. I think our Prime Minister is fond of big ideas. I think he wants to do some grand things. And there's nothing wrong with that, the Prime Minister wanting to do grand things. But I think he mistakes that anything big has to be grand. And all you need to do is some big shake-up, which would obviously be grand. That's the problem. Big things need not always be grand. Big, sudden changes can be disastrous, as was demonetization, as has been Agniveer, and so on and so forth. And, you have this strange tendency, which I call medicines in search of a disease. I have a medicine. What a lovely idea. Now I'm searching for which disease to which this is a good medicine. Our Prime Minister is particularly susceptible to this tendency. He loves certain ideas. And then, of course, with the entire mainstream media at his command, you try and search for, okay, it works in this case. And you remember, all of us remember what happened in demonetization. They first told us that this was the panacea for black money. Then they told us that this was actually going to help digitization. Then they came up with a third justification and a fourth justification. The medicine was always good. It's the disease that kept changing. I think something similar is happening in the case of one nation, one election. Grand idea, big idea that somehow attracts our Prime Minister. And then the entire brigade is trying to search for the political problems to which it is a solution. The problems keep changing. New problems are invented. I'll come back to your question, but let me just illustrate small things. The report, and I read the report very carefully. After all, it's a major document produced by a committee headed by no less than a former president of India. Now, the report says, what is the problem to which this is a solution? One nation, one election. It's a made-to-order report because the very terms of reference of the committee were quite clear. The committee was not asked to say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. The committee was actually asked to suggest ways to how to implement it. But of course, it offers a detailed rationale. I'll give you one rationale offered by committee. The committee says that there is a voters' fatigue, which one nation, one election will solve. Now, Barkha, very few journalists have traveled in this country during elections as much as you. How many voters have you met who've told you कि बहुत वोट दे दे के थक गए हैं भाई, अब और वोट नहीं करना? आप बताइए, how many have you met in your life? I did research on elections for 25 years. I have not found one. People complain of all kinds of things. No one
Yeah.
ever complains of too many elections are happening. So you invent a disease and then you fit your medicine to that. And mind you, this is a serious committee proposing fundamental restructuring of our constitutional structure, which comes up with silly things like this. The report says that it would take something like 300 days in an ordinary year are consumed by elections. Now, which world do they live in? Take me to the country where 300 days are being spent in election proportion in a average year. Even in an election where in the same state you have assembly and parliamentary and panchayat elections in one single year, even that would not consume it. So all kinds of strange reasoning are done. Now let me come to the point that you began with.
Yeah.
We are being told that one nation, one election was the norm, which suddenly was broken by Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi is, of course, responsible for everything that happened in this country. This is such a stupid argument. I'm sorry, I have to say stupid because it is stupid. For the first 20 years of this republic, there was no stipulation that both the elections must happen together. It was a sheer coincidence because when you start the journey, the elections were held together. And because these were years of Congress dominance, no government fell. There was no midterm elections happening because no government fell because Congress had so much majority all the time. So all the
Yeah.
elections kept happening, although we must remember Kerala had already broken from this tendency. Kerala had more than one elections because there were midterm elections in Kerala at that time. Some other states had so, but for most states, because of Congress dominance, it was a political coincidence that kept happening. And mind you, no one is opposing that. I'm not opposing that. If the electoral cycle has this coincidence that Odisha and Andhra Pradesh for the last 2 or 3 elections are going along with the Lok Sabha election, let that be. The real issue under debate is not whether simultaneous elections should be permitted or not. The debate is whether simultaneous elections should be mandated or not. I mean, such elementary things people don't understand and come on national television and start kind of debates on these things.
But I will again ask you, how do you? I get the difference. The debate is not, and we have seen elections. Odisha is an example where there have been simultaneous elections. Andhra Pradesh is an example where there have been simultaneous elections. You're saying you don't have an objection when in the election cycle or for political reasons there is a simultaneous election. Your disagreement is with mandating it in the way that the Modi government wants to do. But one question you still haven't answered is, how do you believe that the coincidental alignment of Lok Sabha and state elections in the first 20 years of this republic worked? Because we must look towards those first 20 years to see if there are any democracy curtailing consequences of simultaneous elections.
What happened in, remember, those 20 years were not normal years of Indian democracy. Indian democracy was coming into being. That those 20 years have been described as Congress system because Congress was not only one of the political parties. Congress was the ruling party. Congress was the opposition. This was Rajni Kothari's formulation that our party system was the Congress system. And
Yeah.
given the dominance of Congress, the fact of simultaneous elections did not make much difference at that time. And of course, it must have given Congress some advantage. My own sense is that as the only party which was the national party at that time, the fact that assembly elections also took place in most of the states along with parliamentary election must have given Congress that little additional advantage. Because remember, in those days, ticket splitting was not the norm. Ticket splitting is a word used when by political scientists when you vote for two different levels of election, but you vote in different ways. You vote for Congress party in national election, but you vote for Janata Dal in the local election. That's ticket splitting.
Yeah.
Ticket splitting was not the norm in the first 20 years. Most people voted for the same party in the Pade Wala vote and Chote Wala vote was given together. So it must have worked to Congress's advantage. We don't have electoral data of very high quality for those years. So that's why I'm saying it must have. My hunch is that this contributed to Congress did better in assembly elections than it would have otherwise done because of the simultaneity of the elections. And my sense is that if the same thing is imposed today as a mandate, what used to happen as a coincidence is made into a mandate, then it would work to the advantage of whatever is the largest national party today.
But let's explore that a bit more, because it presupposes that the Indian voter, known for her sagacity, wisdom, and capacity to bowl a googly just when it's least expected, this formulation presupposes that a voter, if elections are clubbed, gets muddled. Whereas actually we've seen, let's take Delhi, where you and I both are presently. We've actually seen a voter in previous elections, I don't know what the next one will be like, votes entirely differently in the Lok Sabha, where it votes for the BJP, and so far has voted overwhelmingly in support in the last few years for the Aam Aadmi Party in the state elections, right? Now, if that voter has the capacity to see those two different elections in a very different way through a very different lens, why do you believe that that same voter would get confused if the elections were held at the same time?
I'm not saying the voter is confused or stupid. There are, let's look at this, a sophisticated case that we need to understand.
Yeah.
We do increasingly, and over the years, Indian voter has a more differential capacity to differentiate their national level preferences from their state level preferences.
Mm.
Local level
Yeah.
preferences have always been very, very different. They have not been dictated by national preferences. It started, if you remember, in Karnataka in 1984-85, when the voter voted for Congress in 84-85. uh, Ramakrishna Hegde resigned, and within a few
Mm.
months, the voter voted Ramakrishna Hegde back. So, yes, we have seen the beginning of ticket splitting in our country. Voters are getting more and more sophisticated in that technical sense, ability to differentiate. But there are two or three things. Number one, there still is a chunk of voters, could be 20%, could be 30%, who do not make this differentiation very sharply for lack of knowledge, for lack of exposure, lack of information. Number
Mm.
two, even for those who are sophisticated, who are informed, who have exposure, the fact that both the elections are happening simultaneously tends to transform the overall agenda. Agenda is colored more by the national media coverage, national issues, and so on. So, my claim is that holding both these elections together on the same day
Yeah.
will give a small little spike to the national party. It could be 2%, it could be 4%. Even 2% spike is significant enough, Barkha, to change the electoral outcome. You gave the example of Delhi. And Delhi is one of the states where information level is the highest, where all this works. But should both the elections happen on the same day, which hasn't happened in the last 10 years, but suppose on the same day, Lok Sabha and Assembly elections were to take place in Delhi, would BJP do a shade better than it did otherwise? I think it would. Congress would also do a shade better than it would do otherwise. So I'm not saying it
Is
works
that
only to the
psychological?
advantage of BJP.
Is that psychological, or is it because the big national parties have access to more resources, more money, more amplification, that they seize the narrative in a more dominant way?
Absolutely, narrative. In a national election, the overall narrative will be framed as it should be by national questions. And in that situation, obviously a party that is seen to be a bigger player will have an advantage. So take Uttar Pradesh. In Uttar Pradesh, Congress will always do slightly better in a national election. And if national elections are held along with assembly elections, Congress's vote share will go up by 1 or 2%. Take Odisha. My sense is that, of course, BJP did spectacularly well in Odisha Lok Sabha election, but
Yeah.
BJP also scored an unexpected victory in the assembly election. My sense is that BJP may not have been able to score a victory in the assembly election if they were separated, because all the survey evidence of that period pointed out Mr. Modi was popular, people wanted him as a prime minister, they preferred BJP in the Lok Sabha, but they did not have a very poor opinion of Mr. Naveen Patnaik. They could have
Hmm.
voted for him if the elections were held separately. So I'm speaking of 2 to 3%, maybe 2 to 4%. I don't have a very precise estimate of vote swing working to the advantage of the National Party. And I suspect that is one of the calculations behind this one nation, one election ploy. The
Yeah.
idea is to create a slight tilt in the playing ground, which works to the advantage of the BJP.
The BJP, or tomorrow it could be the Congress.
Yes, yes,
Right
of
now it's the
course. Of
BJP.
course, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any national party, and it systematically works to the disadvantage of regional parties.
Now, of course, that raises very interesting questions about how the regional allies of the BJP might respond. But before we come to the politics, let's go through some of the other arguments that are made in favor of such a model. Yes, voter fatigue, I think, is pretty much a ludicrous idea. People love the fact that there is this one thing that equalizes them, and that is the vote. And even in the most troubled areas, I've just come back from Kashmir, even in troubled areas, people are coming out and voting with the kind of enthusiasm that, in fact, more well off, more developed areas don't vote with those numbers. So, voting is something, in fact, the marginalized, the lower income groups feel almost more strongly about. But there are other arguments that are not so readily dismissible. One is money. Why should so much money be spent on elections? And I find that a serious argument that one has to contend with, because we have never been able to look at state funding as an alternative to political funding. We've just had the electoral bonds debate. We know money is paid for in cash under the table. Bonds were supposed to be an answer to that. The Supreme Court struck those down. How do you clean up politics if so much money is spent on constant electioneering? This is a serious question and it merits a serious answer.
Absolutely. So let's look at it. Of course, it's a very serious consideration. Let's look at some broad figures. How much money is spent by the government on conducting one general election? We have estimates for 2014. I'll extrapolate from that. It was 3,800 crore rupees
I
in
have a number in front of me that says that 55,000 crores were spent in 2019. And even a state election like Bihar cost 300 crores. Election Commission says the simultaneous elections would cut down the cost to 5,000 crores in total. This is media reports I'm quoting from,
yeah,
not my
yeah.
own research.
So we're
Yeah.
confusing two things. One is the overall amount spent by political parties, candidates, and everyone put together, which was estimated to be 50,000 crore. The second is
Yeah.
the expenditure made by central government on the bandobast and everything of elections, which was
Yes.
around 4,000 crore in 2019, must have come up to about 8,000, let's say 10,000 crores
Hmm.
now in 2024. That's the upper limit of that.
Yeah.
Now, and let's assume that if you hold assembly elections throughout the country in different phases, another 10,000 crore is spent for that. And as you said, Election Commission itself says that about 5,000 crore rupees would be saved if you do it in one. Let's take these to be correct figures. I'll not
Hmm.
dispute, get into smile and minus.
Okay.
Let's now look at the overall expenditure on election. One estimate last time put it at 50,000 crore rupees by political parties and candidates. I think it was an underestimate. And this time, I'm reasonably sure the overall expenditure was definitely something to the tune of 1 lakh crore rupees. So remember, 90% of the expenditure on elections is being made by political parties and candidates. A
Yes.
substantial bit of that is going into bribing straight away, buying things, giving people things, etc. Now tell me, how much of that would be, how much of this 90% expenditure would be curtailed because you happen to have simultaneous election? It would probably reduce slightly the advertising budgets of political parties. But the real expenditure of election that is made by candidates on things that you and I know, but there are no proof of that, unlikely to go down. Number one. Number two, The official expenditure, yes, will come down by about, let's say, 5,000 crore rupees in a 5-year cycle. So
Mm.
per year, the saving is 1,000 crore rupees, right? How much is 1,000 crore rupees of India's overall budget? India's annual budget. Our annual budget is about 50 lakh crore rupees, central government's budget. So
Mm.
we are speaking not just of a tiny bit of our, and mind you, 1,000 crore rupees could be a small new scheme introduced by the government for agriculture. The latest scheme introduced by the government on agriculture, the scheme called ASHA, is costing 35,000 crore rupees. So please put these things in perspective. Yes, elections cost something. Yes, if you start holding elections not in 5 years, but once in 10 years, you will save money. But the important thing is just this kind of saving. We are speaking of 0.001% of India's annual budget. Is that saving important enough for the overall cause of democracy? That's a question we need to think about. Uh, and therefore, I think yes, some saving, but the overall cost. Please remember that the kind of bribes that are talked about in some of the defense deals, in some of the mining deals, each or some of the big airport, harbor deals, and all kinds of each one of those deals, the amount of bribe that is talked about is several times more than the kind of saving that we are talking about. So, if purely fiscally, if we could have better accountability mechanisms, and if the cost of higher accountability mechanism is 10,000 crore rupees per year, I'm happy to pay that. As a citizen of this country, paying 10,000 crore rupees as an accountability mechanism is not a
Mm.
bad money to spend.
Okay. The other sort of arguments in favor of this proposal is that there isn't enough time spent by governments on policy, on governance, because every government is in perennial election mode. And when you're in perennial election mode, your tendency is to be populist because you have one eye on the vote. You often don't take decisions you might take otherwise because there's just always an election coming. That's one argument. Another argument is constant deployment. We saw in COVID, for example, teachers paid with their lives when in very difficult times they were deployed to serve for elections that were not necessary to be held, but the Allahabad High Court had mandated them at that time in Uttar Pradesh. So, do you find any argument that you agree with in defense of simultaneous polls, or you're not convinced of any of them?
On the deployment of teachers and government employees, of course, it's a big headache. And
Yes,
yes, doing only once in 5 years will reduce the headache slightly. Although I must
yes,
exactly specify, currently we do it thrice in 5 years. And the committee report says it should be done twice in 5 years. It's not once, because the committee
right.
clearly says that Lok Sabha and Assembly elections should be held in one go. And after about 100 days or so, the panchayat and these
Yes.
elections should be held. So in any case, you will have to deploy the teachers separately. So instead of three, it will be 2 terms. Yes, this is a headache. Yes, ways should be found to reduce that headache. But then please remember there are many other headaches of the same kind. There are all kinds of religious congregations, then the ministers and netas come and they take time. So, I mean, is this the only way in which we want to do saving? And in any case, we can have very, very smart ways of handling these things, which is not what the Election Commission is currently doing. But let me come to the other argument, which is the big one, which is that you're not left with any time for governance. Let's break
Mm.
it down into two parts: state government and national government. Let's say you are the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. You were elected in 2022. Your next election is 2027. How many elections do you face in between? One parliamentary election, which happened in 2024.
Mm.
How many days would that consume? Parliamentary election would take, say, if there is a policy freeze, the policy freeze will be about 2.5 months or 3 months. All right. And then in 2027, when you face the next election, you would again have a freeze of about 2 months or so in an assembly election. So in all, let's say 4 to 5 months in a 5-year cycle. What would this report do? This report will cut down those 5 months or 4 months to three, because then it's only the parliamentary election.
Hmm.
All right. Is that a huge difference? Is that something? So the idea that the government is always somehow obsessed with election does not hold at all for the state governments. Now come to the national government. And I suspect that's essentially what the whole thing has been driven by. Poor national government, poor Modi ji has to worry now about J&K, फिर झारखंड का झंझट आ जाएगा, फिर अगले साल दिल्ली, फिर
Hmm.
बिहार. You know, can't think, can't plan really, because there is model code of conduct all the time.
Hmm.
Now, the funny thing, Barkha, is that the idea that model code of conduct does not allow you to announce anything big is proposed in a report which is released during, in a decision which is held during the model code of conduct. Isn't
Hmm.
that funny?
Because
We have
yeah.
model code of conduct in operation for about a month now in this country because of Haryana and Jharkhand. Now, just look at the decisions Modi government has announced. They say they have announced a game changer of a health insurance policy. Whether it's a game changer or not is a different matter. But the government claims it's a game changer.
Hmm.
So a
Hmm.
government which on the one hand is saying, oh my God, we cannot take decisions when model code of conduct is in operation, is in the same breath saying we've taken such a grand game-changing decision on India's health policy, which affects every
Hmm.
single state of this country, including Haryana and Jammu and Kashmir. In the same breath, it also says that we have announced such a major scheme for farmers, which will cost 35,000 crore rupees, Asha. And in the same week, the government also announces something which is a grand idea of changing the constitution, namely one nation, one election. So what is it that you can't do? I mean, the bogus, I mean, how bogus this argument is something that you can see this very week itself.
Okay, I want to explore the politics of it. But before I do that, a lot of questions in our audience stream are contesting your Odisha example, right? And the reason that they're contesting it is they're pointing obviously to the results before in the same holding of simultaneous elections. So let me just read out one such comment because there were four, five of the same kind. Yogendra Yadav is conveniently forgetting that Odisha had given a split verdict in Lok Sabha and Assembly in 2019. In 2024, the voters in the Assembly wanted a change. So I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to this.
Fair enough. It's a good question. And I must confess that I've actually not yet conducted a psephological study. Therefore, what I say
Oh,
in the article is my hunch is. This hunch has to
okay.
be tested. But my hunch is not, that in the past, voters of Odisha had given a split verdict, had given different verdict, does not negate my argument. Because my argument is that even in that situation, the National Party had a jump of about 2 to 3 percentage points. That may result in a victory, that may result in a defeat finally. But you have a little padding, a little bonus is something that the National Party enjoys in a situation where the overall climate and overall narrative is driven by national media, national concerns. So that's my claim. I'm not saying regional parties will never be able to win those elections. No, I'm not saying anything as ridiculous as that. All I'm saying is national party will get an unfair couple of percentage point advantage. I do not have proof for that. Your viewers are absolutely right to say so. Someone should do though. I don't do psephology anymore, but I'm sure some smart psephologist who's watching this program would try and look up the things and come up
Yeah.
to test this hypothesis.
Okay, let's end with whether this is a storm in a teacup. Now, let me explain what I mean. To pass this, to make this into law, this needs the approval of Parliament. And since it will be changing the constitution, it is my understanding that it needs two-thirds majority. We do not yet know what the regional allies of the BJP, Chirag Paswan's party, Chandrababu Naidu, Nitish Kumar, we do not yet know how they are going to respond. If your hypothesis is correct, the regional parties stand to be the at disadvantage, then perhaps they may not. But even if they were all to do it, two-thirds majority in both houses of parliament doesn't look like this can go through. In which case, what is the politics as you see it? You're someone on the opposition to this government, but you are also very agitated by this proposal. Is it a non-starter? And if it's a non-starter, should we even spend so much time talking about it?
As of now, it looks a non-starter. In fact, the report very clearly, very coherently mentions, because that was the principal job of the report. And it says that there are two kinds of amendments that are needed. One set of amendments concern only the parliamentary and the assembly election things. And they contend that that does not require the highest level of ratification. Therefore, you just need two-thirds majority in both houses of parliament for first set of amendments. The second set of amendments, which relate to Panchayati Raj and municipal bodies, you need
Yeah.
a much higher threshold, two-thirds majority in both the houses, plus ratification by half the state assemblies. In any case, the report itself says that you need two-thirds majority in both houses of parliament. The fact is
For
that
the first step,
BJP,
for the first step, just to
even for the
explain this
first step,
simply. So
yeah,
I'm just going to just simplify this just a bit more for our audience. The first step is the holding of the Lok Sabha and the State Assembly in parallel, which does not need the ratification of the assemblies. That can be done with two-thirds majority in both houses of parliament. But now go ahead. The second step
yeah.
would need the ratification of, I think, half the number of assemblies, if I'm not wrong.
That's right. That's a constitutional provision. Constitution
Right.
has three kinds of constitutional amendments. First is very perfunctory, for which you can do it only with simple majority. The committee in
Yes.
its own report says that the amendments that they are proposing fall in the second category, which require two-thirds majority in both the houses. And the committee itself says that we are also proposing another set of amendments concerning panchayat and municipality, which would require the highest, that is the third level of majority, which is two-thirds majority in both the houses, plus ratification by half the assemblies. Someone would contend and say, no, all of it would require that. But in any case, the baseline today is BJP and the NDA does not enjoy two-thirds majority
Right.
and is unlikely to manufacture that because they would have to break India coalition. There's simply no way. I mean, India coalition currently
Right.
holds more than 200 seats in the parliament. And so that they can effectively block anything which would require two-thirds majority. So
So
in
then
that
why?
sense, yes, for the time being, it is a non-starter. The question we should be asking is, why is it that Mr. Modi is pushing something which he knows he cannot carry in the current
Hmm.
composition of parliament? And that, I think, is to do with narrative control. Number one, he wants to, this is something he had proposed with big fanfare before the election. He does not want to be seen as a person who has run away from this. You know, he's already being called a U-turn government. So he would want to
Hmm.
demonstrate that, look, I'm committed, I'm with it, I'll go ahead, and so on and so forth. And the second thing is that Barkha, you and I are discussing this committee report. I'm writing an article on this committee report. While it's possible that you may have otherwise done a program on Mrs. Butch, on what's happening in
Hmm.
SEBI, on
I
what
have.
else is
I
happening with this.
have.
I'm sure you would have done that.
I have done a few, but yes, yes.
Sure. So, I mean, in general, the media would have spent much more time and energy on many of the scandals, many of the things that the government is beset with, the kind of performance the government has failed to deliver, what the government has not managed to do in the first 100 days of its governance. So it's a good distraction. Now, this distraction is not a small thing. I think one thing that Mr. Modi understands better than most other leaders, better than most other political parties, is the business of narrative control and spin doctrine. So, to my mind, all of this is about one, a temporary narrative control and temporary distraction. And second, that's a point Professor Suhas Parshikar makes in many of his writings. This is about discrediting the basic frame of Indian constitution. Go on discrediting the constitutional structure in one way or the other every day. And finally, you say, doesn't it require a change? So something of that is also happening.
But my colleague at the back end is reminding me that when 370 was abrogated, the BJP was able to get it through because of cross voting. So the numbers by themselves, and I wasn't sure of that, but this is what is being thrown up in the
Your colleague is
research.
right, but please remember that in that Lok Sabha, BJP had NDA had 353 seats. NDA on its
Yes.
own, they needed only a small cross voting, and there was no
Here
block,
it would be mammoth.
something like
Here
an
it would be
India block.
mammoth.
Yeah,
Correct.
India controls solid 230 seats on their own. So today the situation, the composition is radically different. Yes, of course, if it was a matter of 10, 15 seats or so, BJP and Mr. Shah could manage, and you know how. This is beyond management. This is much bigger a thing. And Mr. Modi is clearly aware of the ground reality. And this is about floating an idea, letting it be discussed, letting it gain certain ground, so that something like that can be pushed at an opportune moment.
Very interesting, and it certainly makes you want to read through so many like psephologically, politically, constitutionally elections that have taken place. Also, one thing we didn't talk about before we let you go is that the election commission does have the autonomy, and I think this is something you mentioned in your column, to reduce the time span within or the phases of an election, and that is also one
Not
way of
just the
shortening
Yeah,
the
not just
election
the
mode.
phases, not just the
Yes.
phases, Barkha. If the election commission wanted, under the present constitution and law, election commission could have said we would have simultaneous elections in Himachal, sorry, in Jammu Kashmir, uh, Haryana,
Haryana,
Jharkhand,
Maharashtra, and Jharkhand.
Maharashtra, and Delhi.
Yes.
Election commission has
Yes.
all the powers in the constitution to call for an
Yes.
election 6 months before it is due. Now, the funny thing is that the same election commission, which is unwilling to club these three set of elections, is
Yes.
gung ho about clubbing the entire country. Then you begin to wonder, भाई ये बात क्या है, माजरा क्या है, खेल क्या है? यहाँ तो आप ये नहीं कर पा रहे जो आपको कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में राइट, और जिसका राइट नहीं
Ji.
है वो आप करने के लिए बहुत कीन है. And secondly, if you are so worried, and as we should be, about the country being held to ransom for 3 months, no decision, etc., why can't the election commission, for heaven's sake, reduce this business of 7 phases of polling? Please remember, you remember, Barkha, you and I are now old enough to remember these things. In this country, the entire country had polled in one single day in the 1980s. So a country which
Yeah.
has seen that suddenly now feels that you have to do it over 2 months, 7 phases. I mean, I know it's good to allow Prime Minister enough time to do his campaigning, but should the entire campaigning be determined by these things? So there's a bit of laziness. This happened even before Mr. Modi came to power. The 7 phase business in Bengal and such like.
Yeah.
I really think that if Election Commission is serious about the kind of things that it should be worried about, the entire country can poll within 3 phases. There is no reason on earth why Odisha should vote in 4 phases. That's one of the oddest things I've ever heard.
I mean,
So,
I would make an exception for places that have security concerns, Jammu and
so
Kashmir,
that's why I'm
political
saying three
violence like
phases.
Bengal. Yeah.
Exactly. 3 phases is large enough, big enough for you to handle all these. 3 phases spread over 15 days is all that this country needs. Why can't we do it? So instead of first creating a problem and then saying we need a mega solution, which is about changing the constitution, why not begin by doing things that you can do tomorrow morning? If a pill can do, why go for an open heart surgery?
If a pill can do, why go for an open heart surgery is the tantalizing question we will leave our audience with. Thank you, Yogendra Yadav. Always a pleasure. You've given us much to think about. Namaskar and thank you. Take care. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.